During a recent live stream, someone asked if I could make a video showing the equipment that I use for micro soldering repairs. So today I thought I'd give you a brief tour around my workbench so you can see what I'm using. And if you're interested in any of this equipment, you can find purchase links down in the video description. Any purchases that you make through those links will help support my channel, and it won't cost you anything extra. All right, let's check it out. Right over here on the left, we have a multimeter, and over here we have another multimeter. So what's the difference between these two? Well, long story short, this is a much better high quality multimeter. Anytime you buy something from Fluke, you are somewhat paying for the name, but you're definitely getting something of higher quality. So if you want to invest in the best, this is one that you might want to take a look at. This is a 15B plus. They make different variations, but for the most part, you want to have something where you're going to be able to check for continuity, have diode mode, and accurate resistance testing. Now, I don't want to get into too much details on that in this video, but I do recommend this meter if you want something that works really well. Now, this is an inexpensive meter. This is one that I picked up at an auto parts store. It's an Innova 3320. It's definitely nothing spectacular, but so far, most of the readings that I take when I'm checking components on logic boards seem to match up between these two. Now later on, I'm going to do a video that shows you how you can test the accuracy of one multimeter with another. And for the most part, this one is not bad, especially for the price, because it costs probably about a third of the cost that the Fluke is. One thing I would point out though, is that when you buy the Fluke, you can get the official fine point tips probes here that are made for Fluke or by Fluke for their multimeters. I think this one is actually made by a third party, but as nice as these are, I actually prefer the ones that I found over at Fry's Electronics, and these are compatible with the Fluke. So this will plug in over here, and it's got kind of a longer extension here to reach. And even with these, and be careful with these, by the way, they will poke a hole through if you're not careful. Even with these, sometimes when you get down inside of a logic board, it just doesn't seem like you have a lot of room. So I've often been tempted, and in fact, in one of our store locations, I actually soldered a needle to the end of the multimeter so that I could really get a fine point on there and have some room to move around. But these are a couple that I would consider. Again, if you want the best, you definitely want to go with the Fluke, but I think this will get you by for quite a few things, including diode mode, checking resistance, and obviously continuity. Now, beyond that, if you're working on PCB, logic board, anything like that, you definitely want to have something to hold those things steady. There are different types of logic board holders. I made a video on this one recently. It's got magnetic pieces here that you can kind of put the board inside of. I probably should grab a board to kind of demonstrate how that works, but I did make an entire video showing how this thing works. And it has its benefits and drawbacks. Nothing's perfect. This is the basic type. These are very inexpensive, and all these do is you pull them back on this little spring thing here, and you can adjust this, and then you set your board in here, and it'll clip it into place, and that'll kind of hold it. Now, one of the ones that people seem to prefer within the micro soldering community is the Hakko OmniVice. I found these to be helpful in some situations, but not as helpful with my particular microscope setup, and I'll get to that in just a minute. These are great. They are heavy. This thing must weigh like, I don't know, 5 or 10 pounds. So it is nice and sturdy. And of course, the only challenge here is that if your microscope doesn't have a lot of clearance, it's hard to put a board up this high. So what a lot of people will do is put the board inside the vise here, close it down, and then flip it upside down. So that way you can get pretty close to the surface that you're working on. So all of these will work. Different purposes for them. They work better for some, in some applications than others. This is another one that I made a review for. This is kind of cool because you put the logic board in between these two things and you can actually rotate it and get it to different angles, which can be very helpful. And I do find myself often when I'm using this type of board holder, kind of putting something underneath to prop it up because it's nice to be able to see down there at an angle. My microscope does not adjust angles. It just looks straight down. So sometimes you want to kind of get that angled view of your charge port or whatever it is that you happen to be repairing. So, where there's a will, there's a way. I like this design, but the thing is so huge that it makes it very difficult again to work with a microscope that doesn't have a lot of clearance between the work area and whatever it is you happen to be soldering. But you'll definitely need a board holder at some point. Now, what else do we have up here? We have our Captain tape. This is polyamide, I believe that's the way you pronounce it, and this is a heat-resistant tape that you'll see people tape over components in order to shield them or to hold them in place in case they get melted, you know, if the solder that holds a component onto the board gets melted, if you have this tape over it, it's supposed to hold it down so at least it doesn't shift around or blow off the board if you happen to be using hot air. And if you do use this stuff, it can have some drawbacks as well. It kind of shields the airflow, so it may inhibit heat distribution. And if you buy the really cheap stuff, I've been told that if you get it too hot, it kind of warps. And if it warps and starts lifting up, then it's going to pull some components off the logic board. So you definitely want to make sure you get the good stuff if you end up using Kapton tape. I do use it. I've been using it for a long time. And so far, I haven't run into any problems with that. Over here, we have our ammeter, and this isn't really specific to micro soldering, but it does help to diagnose a lot of problems with phones. So if you plug in your USB here and this into a power supply, this will tell you how much amperage is being drawn by the device that's plugged in. I did make a video kind of explaining how this works, so if you want to check that out, I'll put a link, I think it's going to be up there somewhere, and down in the video description, of course. All right, so over here, we have our chem wipes, and I'm going to have to move the camera just a bit here. And these are great if you're working with something and you want to clean up, you want to clean a surface with anything. These do not create lint, and this is a real problem. You know, even if you're just working with LCDs, when you wipe things down, if you use any type of paper, they tend to leave behind traces of the fibers that are inside of them. These don't really do that, so these are really nice. Chemtech, they're inexpensive, and you know, you get 280 in a box. They last virtually forever. Don't drop them. Good thing they're not breakable. Okay, so definitely want to have some chem wipes. There's no reason not to. They're very inexpensive, as is a lot of this stuff. You know, outside of the multimeter so far, none of this really cost a significant amount, probably with the exception of this Omnivice. That one's, I want to say it was about 40, 50 bucks or something like that. But you can definitely survive without it. Now over here I have just kind of my mug of stuff here. This is because I don't have a really good way to organize these. So horsehair brush, this is nice for cleaning things up. This is from MG Chemicals, and really you could use a toothbrush and probably accomplish the same thing, but this is supposed to be designed for cleaning up circuitry when it has flux and other things on it. Let's see, that is not for micro soldering, but I keep it in there anyways. This is my lens pen. This thing is awesome for getting little specks of stuff off of LCDs when you're cleaning them up. Before you put the glass back on, you can wipe them down with this, just kind of brush them off. And then over here, if you unscrew it, if you have any smudges, this thing works really well to remove those. So I know it's not micro soldering stuff, but I really like this. And I was actually, this was recommended to me by a subscriber, and I want to say thanks because I use that thing quite often. Over here we have our nylon tweezers. So these are obviously ESD safe. They won't stick to a magnet. In some cases, these are handy. I don't use them too much for micro soldering, but I did want to point them out because I've got a bunch of tweezers that I use. These swabs right here are for cleaning guns, apparently, or that's their preferred use. And they're great because they come down to a fine point. And a lot of times when we're cleaning things up off the logic board, like old flux, you need to get into some very small areas in order to wipe it. I actually cleaned up the lens on my front-facing camera on my iPhone earlier with some alcohol in this, and it looks 10,000 times better than it was. It had accumulated a bunch of dust on it. Another thing that I'll do sometimes is dip this in alcohol and then just wrap around the top with a chem wipe. So that way you can get several uses out of it, because once this thing gets flux or anything else inside of there, you just want to discard it and grab another one. Well, if you grab a chem wipe and you dip this in alcohol, once that gets dirty, you can just kind of move over and you can continue to use this same swab in different areas, and it goes a little further that way. So maybe that sounds like I'm being cheap, but I get tired of buying this stuff because you go through them quite often, and I think I found that on someone else's video, but it was a great suggestion to make these things last a little bit longer. What else do we have in here? I want to say that's about it as far as micro soldering stuff goes. So I'm going to move this over a bit so you can see some other things. Actually, let's turn on the light. By the way, my bench has a nice little fluorescent light up here. I don't know if you can see that, but up underneath here that kind of illuminates things down. And while we're at it, I might as well show you this stuff. So up here on the back, if you've ever watched my videos, you see I have a kind of a, what do they call this? Not a slot wall. I'm going blank for some reason. In any case, you can get these little deals right here that just, pegboard. You get these little deals that plug into the pegboard and you can hang things up. And then I've got these two magnetic strips that I got at Harbor Freight. They're probably about I don't know, $5 or $6 a piece at the most. And I've strapped these up here with some zip ties, and then anything that's magnetic you can just kind of stick up there. So you want to grab this screwdriver. When you get done, you throw it back on there. And even my wow stick, I was very impressed. That sticks right up there. And anything for micro soldering on that? Probably not. So let's go ahead and move on here, with the exception of maybe these, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. What else do we have here? I'm going to go ahead and move this over so that you can see a few more things, and we'll have to tilt her down. So over here, we've got our power supply. This is just a DC power supply where you can adjust the voltage and the amperage. So we power this on, and if you don't have a battery or you can't connect a battery to the phone, you can use it to power it up. So they sell these adapters here. Let me grab this, and there are a couple different brands that make these. Let's see, am I on camera? So we've got a power cable here, and this particular one I want to say has power supplies for the iPhone 7, the iPhone 6s Plus, I'm not sure, I think this is Samsung right here, iPhone 6s and so forth. So you can buy these for all sorts of different phones, well, mainly iPhones and Samsung, but I'm sure they have a few others out there, and that'll plug right in down here to the DC power supply. You can adjust the voltage and the amount of amperage that's going to whatever it is that you're connected to, and that way you can control it. Also, you've got these little clip-ons here, so if you need to attach that to something, it's already built in, and those will just plug in right down there. I won't go into a detailed explanation of power supply, because if you get one, then I'm assuming you already know what it does. And this one right here, my understanding is that this would be one of the best power supplies you can get for the price. So this is not a very expensive one. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it didn't cost me a whole lot. I think it was about 75 bucks, something like that. And this is the Circuit Specialist PPS 2116A. Again, I'll put all this information down in the bottom in case you need to find it. This little rubber mat right here, I don't always use for micro soldering. I would if my microscope would accommodate this, but it won't, and I'll show you what my workaround was for that in just a second. I would recommend, if you're going to be doing any PS4s, HDMI ports, that you get one of these little files. In fact, I'd get one anyways. These are relatively inexpensive. You can get them in a hardware store, and if you want to kind of file down the HDMI ports before you install them, this is supposed to make it more porous so that the solder will actually stick to it. So you should have much better success with these. And I have a video from a company called Tronics Fix, and he shows how he kind of goes in and he just files down the ports before he installs them, and I'd recommend you do the same thing. And of course, if you're working on PS4s, you want to have some thermal paste compound so that when you take the heatsink off, you can reapply the thermal paste. And in fact, there are some situations where people have problems because Sony did such a crappy job of installing the thermal paste. So definitely Arctic Silver is usually what I get. This is something else, I believe. This is Arctic, I don't even know what. I have some Arctic Silver around here, but I haven't used it for a while, so I have to do some digging to find that. But that is the one that most people, or quite a few people, recommend. Now, getting over here to my actual soldering area, see if we can fit this in here. Here's what I have, and this isn't everything that I want, obviously, but it is what I'm working with at the moment. So I have a fume extractor here. Now, this is by no means a very sophisticated fume extractor, and you see I had to kind of make some modifications here so I could get it level with this platform that I don't like, but that is what it is. But what's nice about this fume extractor is not only does it work at mediocre levels to remove fumes from the area that you're working on, but if you have a warm board that you've been blowing 350 degrees Celsius hot air onto, when you get finished, you need that board to cool down before you put it back in the phone. And if you set this on top of the fan here with this running, now you have a nice little board cooler that will blow cool air over here, and we'll flip it over here, and that will actually cut down on the time that it's going to take for you to get your board down to a temperature where it's safe to put it back in the phone and power it up. So for that, I like it. Again, this is a very basic fume extractor, and the one that I want is going to cost a lot of money, so I'm going to have to save up for that. However, I'll put a link to this fume extractor and a better one down in the video description, and if you want to buy me one for Christmas, that'll be awesome. Okay. Now, as far as my microscopes concerned, and I've unplugged it so you can kind of see, so I can demonstrate what I'm talking about here. I needed a microscope that I could just pick up and take with me when I go to do training at one of our training facilities. So having a big boom arm and everything up here would have been a little extra work, and I like to be able to just grab a hold of this and go, and that's all I need to do. Now, if you're going to be stationary, there are much better options. They're from the same company, Amscope. Again, I'll list the ones that I recommend and the one that I'm using right now. Unless you need to demonstrate what you're microsoldering, you don't need to get a trinocular. So this third little hole right here, you can attach a DSLR camera or a HDMI camera to, and you can project the video onto a screen or save it to a computer or an SD card or something like that. So if you want to give people or be able to record your projects, you can do that. A lot of people will not need this third ocular here, but if you do get one, I would recommend that you consider getting the simulfocal trinocular version, because if you get the shared oculars, what you'll have is a little lever down here that you pull on, and when you do that, it allows your camera to see what's going on, but it also covers up one of these. So then you'll be looking at your microscope with one eye, which is quite annoying, at least for me. I really don't like doing that, so I would recommend you spend the extra money if you go with the trinocular setup. Now, if you don't need this, if you don't need to put what you're doing on a camera or on a screen or anything else, you can do without that completely. It'll save you some money. It's cheaper to buy a head that just has the two oculars and not this third one on here. So, you know, something to take into consideration. Obviously, the long-term value of one with this third ocular will be better. It's all a tax write-off for the most part, but it will cost you more money. So that's entirely up to you. You will need to get a ring light. They make one at Amscope, but I actually found this on Amazon, and it works great and costs a bit less. So all this does, let's go ahead and take it off the scope here, and you will need to be able to see what you're doing. So these are LEDs, and they turn on, they're adjustable, and I like this because the switch and the dimmer are built in right here. You don't have to have a separate module, and the one I looked at on the Amscope website actually had a completely separate power supply where you had to turn it off and on over here and have extra cords running. And with this one, you just click the button and it's on, and then if you come over here, you can adjust the dimmer and you can get whatever amount of light you want on your project down here in your work area. So for this, I would definitely recommend this ring light. I would not recommend this particular microscope for a lot of people, so unless you want something that's mobile, consider getting the one that has the boom arm stand attached. It gives you a lot more freedom to move around, see what you're doing, and I'll say that it definitely pays to do your research. One of the other reasons I didn't want to get the boom stand for the microscope is because I watched a video where someone was doing microsoldering and their microscope kept bouncing around, and I thought that's ridiculous. There's no way that you can microsolder if your scope doesn't stay still, and I've got wood floors in here, so if I jump up and down on the floor, the whole thing's going to start moving. Well, it turns out that the problem with that person was having was not with the scope, it was with the table they had their scope set on. So that was my fault for not thoroughly investigating that. If you get the boom arm stand, they are quite heavy, and as long as your table is stable and doesn't move around, you shouldn't have any problems with those bouncing, and they're definitely a lot more convenient. They give you a lot more freedom of mobility to get around as you're operating your scope. So you can see what I did here. I would have preferred to have a microscope that just allowed me to work on my own bench, but this comes with a platform here. And what I've done is I got a piece of silicone mat here that's somewhat heat resistant, and I just cut out a little hole there so it'll fit on top of this, and that's not the best way to go. And really, this silicone is so thin that when you heat it up, it starts to bubble. So the first mat that I showed you would be a much better option, but mine won't really fit on here. So I don't know, I've got to figure something out. I'm either going to go ahead and buy the boom stand or do a DIY version, which I saw that looked pretty cool and looked like it might actually work. So if I do, I'll definitely make a video of that one. But what you really need to do is make sure that when you set this down, you can see that's getting kind of old. This needs to be replaced. When you set this down, it has to be level, because if I was underneath this platform, I wouldn't be able to get good airflow in there. So that's why I kind of elevated this so I can get this thing right on here, everything sealed around the bottom, and I get the most fume extraction that I'm going to get out of this particular unit at the time. All right, so I'm not sure, but I may have cut out a bunch of stuff there because I did not have a monitor set up so I can see what you can see. So hopefully I didn't skip too much. I believe that I got everything on the fume extractor and the scope. And from here, what I wanted to talk about was solder. So what you'll typically see people using is this right here. This is the Kester 6337. This does contain lead, and therefore it is slightly easier to work with, and also a good reason for having some sort of fume extraction system. You definitely don't want to be breathing the fumes from this stuff. Most of what comes out of it when you see the smoke coming up is going to be from the flux, but if you get it hot enough, you can theoretically atomize lead, and if that gets into the air and you breathe it, it gets in your body, it doesn't go away. Your body does not have an effective way to eliminate heavy metals, and if that stuff builds up over time, you can have some problems. So definitely make sure that you have a good fume extractor, especially when you're using leaded solder. If you need a larger quantity, they sell it on a big spool like this. So this would be something that would last you quite a while, I would think, unless you're just doing a ridiculous amount of soldering. Over here I have my alcohol dispenser. I really like this type with the pop top because I have been known to knock these things over. So when I get done using it, I just clamp it shut, and even if it goes this way, I'm not going to get a bunch of alcohol pouring out on the floor or on the table, which is not just a headache to deal with because you really have to kind of wait for it to evaporate. There's not a good way to really clean up alcohol or spilled gas for that matter, other than maybe getting something like cat litter and covering it up. Now this is my bag of flux. Probably not the best way to organize it, but one thing about flux is that when you get it on your hands, it is a pain to clean off. And really, the best way I found to clean flux off of your hands is with rubbing alcohol. And of course, that is not great for your skin. So for that reason, one thing that I skipped over here in this section I wanted to show you was powder-free nitrile gloves. If you get a pair of these and you put them on before you start doing any micro soldering, you won't have to worry about cleaning up your hands, which will save you a little bit of time. And these are super cheap. I got this box at Harbor Freight. I think you get 100 for about $7 or $8. Sometimes they go on sale. So no reason not to use that. They also come in handy if you're working with LCDs and you don't want to get your fingerprints on them. There are plenty of different brands of flux out there, and for the most part, I found that they all work pretty well, but I have a preference for the MG Chemicals brand. This seems to work really well. This is no clean flux, so it's not supposed to be corrosive to the board. We'll still clean it off anyways. We don't want to leave a big mess on the inside. The Chip Quick, I actually enjoy. I like using this for removing components because it flows really well. It's easy to get on the board, but for some odd reason, even with the fume extractor, the fumes from this thing give me a headache. I don't know why. Let's see. Over here we have more MG Chemicals. I know that I have something that says Amtech, and apparently it's very questionable as to whether these are legitimate or not, depending on where you buy them. So if you buy the Amtech, I believe it's the 559, NC 559 or something like that. This is kind of worn off, and I can feel it sticking to my fingers because these things tend to leak. And really, I am open to a suggestion as to how to get these plungers installed so that they don't just fall out of the back, because this is a problem that I run into on this particular one. It doesn't really, even if I cover this up and really push this on there, it just doesn't stay inside most of the time. And you need to be able to pull these back. Otherwise, if you have something like this MG Chemicals, if there's any pressure inside, it will just kind of continue to ooze. So you've got to kind of pull it back like you would a syringe to keep that little bit from coming on the end. Anyways, getting a little too detailed there. What I was getting at on the Amtech is apparently there's a lot of fake stuff floating around with this name on it, so you want to make sure that you get the real thing, because if you don't, apparently the knockoff stuff is not very effective. But for the most part, I haven't had any trouble with the MG Chemicals and the Chip Quick, other than getting a headache if you breathe the fumes on that last one too much. But for the most part, that will take care of your flux needs in most cases, in many cases I should say. All right, so let's reposition this thing. So I want to get to the heart of the soldering setup. Let's see if I've actually missed anything here. So over here in this corner, you can see I'm pretty cramped. I don't have a whole lot of room to work with. So I kind of got everything stuck together here, but that works because that way I can kind of reach whatever I need pretty easily. Over here, I've got my heat sinks. So a lot of times you'll see people throw a coin on top of the ICs as they're working on components in that vicinity, because this will help hopefully to pull some of that heat away from that component. So you want to have some coins. Pennies seem to be one of the ones that get used quite a bit. You'll definitely need solder wick if you're soldering. So I wanted to show you this one because this is one to avoid. If you grab some of the soldering wick is not necessarily designed for the stuff that we do, and this particular one is very thick, so it's hard to get it hot enough in order to pull the solder off of whatever it is that you want to be desoldering. So you want to get something that's nice and thin when you're working with micro soldering projects. These two brands here, I bought the MG Chemicals again, works very well. This one is called Gootwick, and I bought this on the recommendation of another micro soldering pro. And really, I find that they all work pretty well. You know, as long as they're thin, I don't have too much trouble with any type of solder braid. That's the main thing, is make sure that it's very thin so that it'll transfer heat well enough and absorb whatever it is that you happen to be working on. Over here we've got some cold spray. This is good for finding hot spots on a logic board. It's a very crude method, I think, of figuring out if you've got a short somewhere that's generating heat, but it works. You spray this on, and I'll do a demonstration of this in another video. Many have been done already, but if you spray this on and you plug in your board or your power supply and turn it on, you'll see immediately the area that melts first, and this actually creates basically an ice coating on whatever you're working with, so you can tell what's heating up right away. Over here, let's see, what have I skipped? Oh, over here we have our ZXW dongle. Probably could not live without this. This will show you board view schematics for a lot of popular phones, so it can tell you what's plugged into what the values are, and where they go to, and putting this together with the actual schematic for the device you're working on should hopefully help you to solve a lot of problems. That's what that is designed for. And what they do is you buy this little USB stick, and then you pay a yearly subscription. I think it's 80, 90 bucks a year or something like that, but very helpful, should absolutely pay for itself. Over here we have the two main pieces of equipment, I should say 2 out of 3. So you need your scope, you need hot air, and you need a soldering station. Let's come in a little closer here so you can get a better view. So bring this down. Right, so on the right hand side here I have the Quick 861DW, and this, my understanding, and I have no reason to doubt this, is that for the money, this is one of the best hot air stations that you can buy. It's got presets here on these channels, so if you turn on the power and you say, and you can set these up beforehand, channel 1, channel 2, channel 3. Right now I've got channel 1 set up to 150 degrees Celsius, and 60 is the airflow measurement here. And that is typically going to be used, that's not a whole lot of heat, but it seems to be ideal for loosening up that black tarry stuff that's on the circuit boards inside of iPhones, so that you can take a pick or a pair of tweezers or something and kind of work that away. And then if I want to bump it up, I just hit channel 2, and that's going to go to my second preset, which is currently at 365 and 70, and you can see how fast this thing warms up. I mean, it's like that. Number 3 is going to be maximum temperature and airflow, so it goes up to 500 degrees Celsius, 120 airflow, and this is great if you're trying to remove the shielding off of an iPhone. It doesn't take very long. It gets very hot very fast. And what's cool about this is that the moment that you set it down on its stand, which is completely safe for the heat here, it's going to continue pumping air through here until it cools down to a safe temperature. I want to say it's 150 or 100. So it will continue blowing the air through there until it cools down, and then it will automatically shut off. Now you'll have to have a nozzle on here in most situations when you're working, and they come in a variety of diameters, so everything from this little tiny one here all the way up to this big nozzle here. And sometimes I actually work with no nozzle, again mainly when I'm removing the shielding off of an iPhone or something like that. One thing I will note here is that if you order these nozzles with your hot air station, make sure you read the description, because they actually include a couple of these, at least the source that I bought this from, they include a couple of these nozzles, and I went ahead and ordered a variety, and I ended up with duplicates. So I've got 2 of these and 2 of these in the back. Not a big deal, but I spent some extra money that I didn't really need to. So once it's done cooling down and the air shut off, that's when I would go ahead and turn the power off if you're finished working with it for the day and you're going to walk away and you want to make sure that you're safe there. On the left hand side here, I've got the Hakko or Hakko FM203, and the reason that I chose this particular soldering station is because it has dual ports here, and one thing that really annoys me is having to switch the tips on my soldering iron, because if they're hot, there's not really a safe way to do that that's healthy for your soldering station. So if you take one of these gloves, you can actually take off a hot tip from your soldering iron, but that's not really a great idea. You know, it's preferred really that you let it cool down. So having 2 separate wands that you can plug in makes it great. You know, if you have 2 tips that you use quite often, you can have them both plugged in, and this has dual temperature controls. I'm going to bring this down a little further so that you can kind of get a better view. of this. Let's get this freeze spray out of the way. And okay, so on this station, let me get a little closer here. Sorry about all the bumping around here. On this station, the main power switch is on the back. So once you turn that on, you'll see a digital display here on the front, and it's going to start preheating these to whatever they're set to. So you can set the temperature on the left-hand port and on the right-hand port ahead of time so that they automatically go up to whatever you want them to be. And when they reach that temperature, you'll hear an audible beep. So it'll let you know. In that period of time while I was talking, it went from 0 to 400 degrees Celsius on this side. And you can see that the D, hopefully you can see over there on the left-hand side, that one's D and that one's S. I don't know why. That one's already on. That's at that temperature right now, which is cool. If you leave it unattended for a short period of time, or for a medium period of time, I guess, it will actually go into sleep mode and allow your iron to cool down. I wouldn't rely on that for safety, obviously. If you get finished using this thing, you want to turn the power off. If that falls off and lands on anything, it's going to melt right through it or start a fire, and definitely don't want that to happen. You see what just happened now is when I touched this one, it actually turned on this other iron right here. And the reason it did that is because on the back of this little deal, there is a cord that is connected. Let's not burn that up. This cord is connected to the back of the soldering station, and it actually senses when you pick up the iron. So the moment that you pick up the iron, it knows that you're using this. When you set it down, it knows that it's not in use, so it will be able to tell when to go into sleep mode. And when I pick up this one, if you watch this light down here, hopefully you can see that the S is turned on. When I pick this one up, it's going to switch over to the other side because it automatically knows that this is what I'm using. And this is probably the second main reason that I bought this station, and that is in order to have a good pair of micro tweezers. And I'll show you another station at the end of this video that I've used and that can be used that will cost a lot less money. This is a sizable investment, but getting a good pair of micro tweezers for a cheap soldering station is going to be tricky. They don't really make them that I'm aware of. So this is one of the things where you really want to think about what you're going to be doing and how much money you plan on making with your equipment, because obviously to justify this purchase for someone who's just a casual hobbyist and wants to do some basic soldering stuff, it may be a lot more than you need. If you're going to be working on the inside of phones, iPhones, Galaxies, that kind of stuff, this is kind of what you're probably going to want to go with, at least when you get to the components on the PCB itself. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If you're doing just charging ports, you can probably get by with a number of other options that will cost you less money, but I would still recommend this hot air station to anyone who's doing any sort of soldering. It does cost a few hundred to get it, but it is 10 times better than the cheap hot air stations that I've used and one of the other ones that I have, which I'll get to shortly. So I'm gonna move some things around here so I'll have a little more room. Actually, I'm just gonna go into my box of tricks. So as you can see, I kind of ran out of room here. So over here, I have some bins set up for even more stuff that I use for micro soldering. And this is kind of my box of assorted things that don't really fit into necessarily any particular category. So we have a couple different types of jumper wire, and I got this one from microsoldering.com. He's got quite a few micro soldering supplies on there, and they come in different gauges. So this one right here, the 34 AWG, this is something I would use if I had to run a jumper, say, inside of an HDMI port on a PlayStation. This type of wire will work for phones, but it's not going to be heavy enough for the current that's going to be going through something larger like that. So this is the gauge that I use for PlayStation and larger circuit boards. And then this mechanic solder, this is a 0.02 millimeter. It is literally like hair thin. Let's see if we can get this open. It's super, super thin. I don't know if you can even see it. There's a strand right there. I think you can see that. But when you get underneath a microscope inside of an iPhone, that actually looks huge. So there's just not a lot of room to work around, and you need something very lightweight, and they don't need anything that heavy for the most part, especially if you're working on something that's just transferring data from one place to another. So those are the two jumper wires that I use. This is the mechanic solder paste. That is one option as far as when it comes to putting new balls on an integrated circuit. And this one I just got because for some reason these always disappear out of the refrigerator. They're supposed to be kept refrigerated, and if you put it in the refrigerator, it always gets thrown away. And I'm tired of dealing with that, so I don't know what the solution is, except maybe just don't put it in the refrigerator anymore. Over here, we have these little stencils for ball grid array components. This one is for an iPhone 6s. They make these for different models of phones. This is an iPhone 6, and I think we've got a 7 around here. I know I have a 7 around here somewhere, or it may be out on loan. In any case, they make these for the integrated circuits so that when you take them out of the phones, you can clean off the old ball grid array and then put new ones on. And you can either use the mechanic solder paste for that, or you can actually buy these solder balls, and these are tiny. This is a 0.025. Hopefully you can see that. These are individual balls of solder that kind of look like they're smaller than grains of sand. I mean, they're tiny. And what we often need to do, in the case of something like this, is that we need to get one of each of those balls inside of each one of those holes there, and there are some shortcuts to make that happen. I'll get to that also in another video. I just want to get through this equipment here. You'll definitely want to have some good tweezers. There are many different companies that make them, and there are some that are better than others, and I'll just say that these are good enough to get by for precision, so they do the trick. I've used these. Let's see, it says only you. 7SA. I think 7SA seems to be used by quite a few different manufacturers. These are the CHP 3SAs, and the main difference here is that these are going to be straight at the end and these are going to be curved, and there are a lot of situations where this comes in very handy so that you don't have to bend your wrist into some awkward position to reach what you're getting to. And you can see these have some debris and stuff on them, and I always keep several sets of tweezers. Here's another curved one. These are the WLXY, and these are actually pretty decent. I was surprised. I had a supplier out of China ask me about buying stuff, and I said, well, send me a sample, and these actually ended up being pretty decent. They've held up well, and I think if you keep these little plastic covers on them, they're much less likely to get bent if you happen to drop them on the floor. Now, at the same time, I always keep a cheap pair of tweezers around here. I don't know what these are. These are just some crappy ones that I will use for prying. And the moment you pry them, obviously, they're no longer really precision tweezers, but that's exactly, let's get over here. That's exactly why I keep these around, so that I have something I can pry with, and then I have something I can pick up very small things with and be confident that the tips are gonna meet up close enough so that I can grab a hold of whatever it is that I'm after. Here's a slightly larger container of solder balls. These are 0.0 or 0.25. So these are bigger. And over here we have another one. And I honestly don't even know what size these are. I'd have to get a look at them under the scope. So I don't know why I have 3 different jars, but I do for some reason. All right, over here we have some solder mask. So this stuff right here is UV curable. And what you're going to do with this is, if you've got a component that you've exposed on the logic board and you need to cover it up so that nothing accidentally touches it or anything conductive happens to get, inside there and cause some problems, you apply this on top of the area that you're working with. The less, the better. You don't want to make this stuff very thick. And after you do, you can come back with a UV flashlight. Geez, I'm all messed up here. This is a UV flashlight, and this is used for curing this, this stuff here. And if you don't want to take the time to hold the, I'm going to grab the camera here, so it's going to get a bit shaky for a minute. But if you don't want to have to grab a hold of that flashlight, you can get one of these little nail curing deals here. And this is another one that we've used for curing the Loca on glass-only repairs. And it can also be used in order to cure this solder mask, and it doesn't take very long. Those are your 2 of your options. You can also set it out in the sun, because there's definitely UV coming from the sun. So on a bright sunny day, you can absolutely use that to cure your stuff. But I don't think you want to leave your logic board sitting outside, most likely. Now inside here, I have my poker. For whatever reason, I find that this works way better than a pair of tweezers, especially if you're trying to point something out to someone. If you're working inside the phone and you want to point to something under the microscope, if you point at it like this, it's very difficult to tell which thing you're pointing to. So I find this comes in useful for a lot of different things, pointing things out, moving things around. If I need to line up a screw hole with the logic board, if it's not aligning properly, I can push this down inside and kind of wiggle it. So this is a good use for cheap tweezers. Just break them in half, and then you have one of these laying around. And we have another set of tweezers. You can really never have too many good tweezers. These are the TS12 from Guji, I don't know what that name is. Here we have some ESD brushes, so if you need to brush something off and make sure no static gets inside, this will do the trick. Over here we have some low melt, I think this is from Chip Quick. Anyways, this is very low melt solder wire. It melts super, super easy at a very low temperature. I want to say it's like, I don't know, 78 degrees Celsius. Got to tell you, I really don't use this stuff for a number of reasons. It makes a huge mess, so you have to be very careful with it, and it does not conduct well. So you don't want this in your circuitry because it contains, what is it? It contains a certain element, and off the top of my head, I can't remember what it was. I want to say it's, I'm going blank. I'll have to look it up. But there's something in here that is just not good for conducting electricity. So this is okay for removing things, but if you use it, you want to make sure it's completely gone before you soldering anything else down, or else you're going to have some problems. Now, I keep a box of these. These are hypodermic needles, and they come in handy for kind of scraping things once in a while. But of course, you want to be very careful with these and make sure that you're not violating any laws in your state by having them. I think as long as you don't have it attached to a syringe, you're okay. You know, unless you have diabetes or something else, some sort of prescription that says that you can have a hypodermic needle, you want to be very careful. So this is just the needle. There is no syringe, but you can obviously do some damage with this and cause some infections if you're not careful. So you don't want to end up poking yourself with that. Fortunately, they are quite inexpensive. Over here, we have this little gadget that I thought was cool. So this is kind of like an X-Acto knife, but it has a whole bunch of little attachments here. Everything from a blade to these little paddles, if you want to call them that. And they're super thin. And what these are good for is getting underneath a chip. So if you're trying to lift an integrated circuit off the board and you can't really get to it with your tweezers, sometimes you can come in from the side and just go underneath and lift it up with that. So, and these just go into the end here. You loosen this thing up, and let's see if I can do this with one hand here. That'll just go into the end like so. Oh, come on. Of course, this is I'm gonna have to set this down. So this is gonna go into the end. Tighten it down, and there you have a nice little handle to work with to hold this. Now, just yesterday, I was attempting to take the, well, actually, I took the Wi-Fi chip off of a Galaxy S4 using that, and then I got inside and saw what this thing looked like. It's crazy. It has a ball grid array around the edges, but there are actually components on the inside. Came off without any damage, but I don't know how I'm going to add solder balls onto this thing because I don't have a stencil that will fit it, and trying to do it by hand was just a mess. So if anyone has any suggestions on that, that would be great. I know it's an old phone, but hey, we fix stuff around here. It's what we do. Now inside here, there's one last thing that I wanted to show you, and that is this. These are practice boards. So these are designed in order to help you practice soldering. And if you can see, there are some components here that you attach onto the board, then you can go back with your multimeter and test your work and make sure everything's connected. I'll make a separate video to show you what we do with these, but in my opinion, this is a really easy way to learn soldering concepts and understand how your equipment and your supplies will work when you're soldering at a slightly larger scale than what you'll be working with inside of a phone. So this is a training tool that I keep, and actually I give these away once in a while. They're very inexpensive. They're like $1 or $2 each. Buy a few at a time, and you can get lots of practice with soldering and desoldering, whether you're using an iron or hot air. Now I'm going to shift over here back to the soldering station, and you see the little SLP. That means that this thing has gone to sleep. So these are actually cooling down at this point, and if I walked away, they wouldn't heat up, but I'm still going to kill the power because we don't want to take any chances, of course, leaving a hot iron or a hot air station or anything like that turned on. I've seen things go really bad. Now it's going to take me a second, so I'm going to stop the camera and go set up my old soldering station and show you what I used to be working with. All right, so I actually forgot a couple things while I was over there. There's a lot here, you know, you just don't realize what you accumulate over time. So one thing I wanted to point out that's kind of cool about this Hakko system is that they use cartridges. So when you want to change out your tips, you just pull this thing out. You've got to go from the bottom, and then you can lift out the entire cartridge, and then whatever tip you want to attach to this wand. There are various types. You know, there's some that are better for doing things like cleaning up flat areas. And then we have ones that are very, very small on the end to get into tight spaces. And then we've got this curved tip here, which I really like because it just makes it easier to work. You know, you can come in this way and it's already going along the area that you're working on. This isn't going to be a soldering tutorial, but so you kind of get the idea. And then we have a very heavy tip. And why would you need a larger tip if you've already got something similar, which I thought I actually have a smaller one like this somewhere. But in any case, you'll run into situations where you need to be able to transfer a large amount of heat. And if you have something very small like this, even though the temperature gets up to, you know, let's say 450, it's not going to be able to get that heat from the soldering tip to the surface that you're working with because it doesn't have the surface area necessary. So in that case, you know, if I'm working on something like a PS4 and I want to mix in some lower temperatured solder, I'll use something with a larger tip like that. And by the way, that is probably one of the craziest things you'll ever have to melt is the solder on an HDMI port inside of a PS4. And for that, we typically use hot air, but you can mix in some lower temperature solder before you do that. So that is one of the advantages to this system, is having this whole cartridge deal. And I'll tell you right now, if you get an error when you plug it in, if you have one of these, always make sure that after you install the cartridge into the wand, that you go back and you push down on the tip, because if it's not all the way inside, you'll think that your soldering station doesn't work. I did that right out of the box when I got it. Also, you want to keep your tips clean, so this will generally come with the soldering station, and no matter what you're using to solder, you definitely want to get these gold coils. These are awesome. They actually have some tin inside here. There are tip tinners like this where you can go in and dip this in first, or you can actually take your solder wire and just add some to the tip to tin it, but you want to be able to remove any excess debris that's on here and keep your tips nice and shiny. Hopefully you can see that. You know, I try to keep these coated with some solder so that way they don't oxidize while they're sitting in the room, because we're surrounded by oxygen and that is our enemy when we're soldering. So you want to keep these nice and shiny, keep them coated with some tin on the tip. And if you go in here and just gently push it into the coils here, this will kind of wipe down the tip and add some tin onto your iron. So these are really cheap, and again, no matter what you're using, you want to make sure you have these, and then you'll see that it actually collects all of the excess or used solder that comes off the tips down here in the bottom, and you can just dump this out, I imagine. Hopefully, you know, there's probably a proper way to dispose of this, and I'm not sure what that is. I have to think about that one. It's probably not a great idea to throw it into the trash, but it's got to go somewhere. Over here, I wanted to show you this. This is a station that I used for several years. And when I say that, I mean I've used this type of station for several years. I didn't use this one for several years because they don't last for several years. And that's one of the main problems with something like this. Now the advantage to this one, this is the 852D+, is that it has hot air and soldering station built in. So if I find my soldering iron here, I'll plug it in. I forgot about that. So this will actually have a handpiece that comes with it. And you'll plug this in right down here. So now you've got hot air and a soldering iron all in one set. Now, why wouldn't I just do that and save a lot of money? Because you can, I think I picked this thing up for probably under $100. It's probably around maybe 100, 125 at the most. And the way that this works is that you kind of, when this is cool, obviously, you just twist off this little screw here, remove this collar, and then you can change out the tips. And you can buy different types of tips. Inside we have a heating element. This one looks like it's slightly damaged at the moment, but you can pick up a variety of tips for this type of iron. There's going to be the curved tip like I showed you earlier. There's going to be the fine point tips. We'll have chisel tips and knife edge tips and hatchet tips and all kinds of stuff. So there's a variety of tips that you can put on here. One of the downsides here being that you've got to kind of wait for this to cool down before you switch those out. Obviously, it's not going to be very high quality for that price. And you want to be very careful when you tighten these, because if you over tighten this and you end up turning this bottom half, it will actually break off the connection inside, and then your element won't get hot anymore. The other problem with this is that when you look at this number over here, if I turn on the soldering station, I've got my safety off. So there's a separate switch in the back that will kill the power completely, and once that's on, you'll see these little lines come up. Turn on the soldering iron and it will give you soldering temperature. But this will not be, once this gets up to 270, which is what it's set to now, that's telling you that 270 is the temperature of the white filament on the inside of the iron that I just showed you. It does not mean that this tip is at 270. So this thing will take a long time to heat up. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get a lot of jobs done with it. You absolutely can. Like I said, I used this for years. I was doing charging ports forever, all the way back into the BlackBerry Bold days. You know, we used to do Motorola V3 charge ports, all sorts of stuff with these. But it takes a long time to heat up. The heat is not consistent. Sometimes it seems like the tip gets colder and hotter, and it's very difficult to say, okay, I'm at exactly 270 degrees Celsius, because you probably aren't. You really won't know 100% what your temperature is, and it will take some getting used to. Now again, you can get a lot of things done with this. I'm not gonna say that it's worthless, and it's definitely gonna cost you a lot less money. But the argument has been made that, you know, hey, you'll never regret buying the best, and if you buy something that doesn't do the job properly, you might think that you're not good at soldering when in fact you're actually pretty decent, you just don't have good equipment. Well, that's true. You can't argue with that. And at the same time, I would say that if you have one of these stations and you do well with it and you're able to accomplish a lot of repairs, such as charge port, you know, micro USB, that kind of stuff, then you're probably going to do even better when you get some better equipment. So it's really a matter of weighing how much you want to invest and what you expect your outcome to be. So I don't mind recommending something like this to someone who's a beginner, doesn't have a lot of money, and hasn't really decided that they want to fully invest in doing this as an occupation. You know, if you want to tinker around and do some experiments and use some practice boards and try to get familiar with how soldering works, this will get a lot of things done. You might be surprised at what you can accomplish with it. We've been also done some PS4 HDMI ports with this thing, and it will come with a variety of nozzles. These are a little trickier because on the Quick, you just plug them in. On this one, you got to put it on here, get your screwdriver, tighten this thing down so it stays in place. And I have seen these last probably about 1.5 years at the most, and then typically the hot air will go out. Sometimes they'll last you less than that. You'll usually get very close to the warranty period by the time they die, but you'll be replacing this almost every year. You won't have consistent temperature on your hot air or on your soldering iron. So it's going to take a lot more just having a feel for how this thing works and how it behaves on any given day. It will take a lot longer to heat up. And if you're doing micro soldering as a profession, you really probably don't have the time to deal with something like this. So there's good and bad. You know, again, the main benefit here is that you don't have to invest a lot of money up front. It does have hot air and a soldering station. But you know, you really don't know what you're capable of doing until you have some decent equipment. You can see this has been sitting here just kind of collecting dust because I don't really use it too much. Over here on the hot air side, we have a switch that we can turn on, and you can adjust your min-max. This is approximately the temperature you're working with. And over here, you can adjust your airflow. And if you ever end up with one of these, and it'll run the same way. So I've turned it off, but the air is going to keep running until this thing cools down, and we can hang it up right here. But I'll warn you, if you happen to use one of these and you turn the airflow down too low and the temperature up too high, this thing will start smoking and you'll have to evacuate the building and maybe even grab a fire extinguisher. So if this doesn't have the required airflow going through here, it actually allows you to turn the temperature up to a dangerous level to where this thing will just start burning itself up. So again, for the money, I don't expect a lot, but you might be able to accomplish some very basic tasks. And as I stated, you know, a lot of people are using these now and getting the job done. So not my preference, but I'm not going to say that it's completely worthless because it has made me enough money in the past for that, you know, to allow me to get to the point where I can invest in something better. Now, getting back to this, I will also leave you with one consideration, and that is this. If you invest in something that costs more than you're, you know, really 100% comfortable in investing in, right now, I'm convinced that I wouldn't have any problem finding someone who wants one of those, or even this microscope. So you can kind of think of it this way. If things don't work out, you won't get everything back that you invested, but you probably won't have a hard time finding someone who would take this stuff off your hands at a pretty decent percentage of what you paid for it. When I change things around, I will add to this video. Oh, one last thing here. Yeah, I keep forgetting. I've got so much stuff. Down here on the bottom shelf of my workbench is the ultrasonic cleaner and the Branson fluid, Branson EC. And if you're going to be working on logic boards and getting flux and liquid damage and other things on the inside of them, you want to have something like this. This is not the top of the line, but it will get the job done. It has the degas feature and the multi-sweep. So for phone logic boards, this actually, whoops, and it's messy. That's why I have it on the bottom shelf. But this will function, and I'll make a separate video for this also to kind of demonstrate how that works. For the money, I think it's one of the better investments as far as ultrasonic cleaners go, if you don't want to spend a ton. If you found the video helpful, like it, share it, check out my channel for more tutorials and product reviews, and most of all, remember to hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave your feedback in the comments section, and thanks for watching.